Shulchan Aruch, the abridged code of Jewish law, chapter 80, and we are up to number 35, Lamed Hay. So last week we went out of our normal study and we spoke about Shavuos instead. So now we have to recall 2 weeks ago, which sometimes feels like a lifetime ago. So much can happen. And I apologize again, as I admit people on my screen, my finger goes across the camera. Anyway, number 35. So last time we were speaking about drying clothes, and there were two issues. One issue, well, really three issues, actually. One issue that we spoke about was it gives the appearance of laundry, doing laundry, when we hang up clothes to dry. They got wet on Shabbos. And laundry is it's an offshoot of dyeing, well, actually bleaching. So, it's cleaning out the stains. The other issue was schita, was squeezing out the liquid from the clothes. So we've discussed this a few times with washcloths and various things. So it comes from threshing. The melacha, the primary activity that was done in the building of the Mishkan was threshing. And it's taking something edible out from a husk. So the primary melacha, the way it was done for the Mishkan, was with wheat or grain. But taking a liquid that's edible or drinkable out of another substance is a derivative of this melacha. So if we had waterlogged clothes and we're squeezing the water out, then that can make a problem. So because that's a problem, we have a rabbinic decree that we're going to discuss in number 35 to avoid this issue. So let's read it together and then we'll discuss it. Also, just before we start, I'll just mention, because I'm on the phone, instead of a computer screen, I only have a few people on the screen at once. It gives me multiple screens to slide across. So if someone raises their hand to ask a question and they're not happen to be on the screen I'm looking at the moment, then I won't see them. So if you have a question, just unmute yourself and ask. Don't wait for me to notice you, because unfortunately I can only see a few people at once. Okay, number 35, Lamed Hay. Haya Hoylech, a person was traveling, right? He was walking. The Yarda Geshamim Alav Al Bagadov, and the rains came down, right? He got wet, his clothes got wet. So Mutter Leilech Lebeisoi. He is allowed to go home, to keep walking home, right? We don't say he has to stand perfectly still to the end of Shabbos, in case he squeezes his clothes. Two reasons, and as we explained before, neither of these reasons on their own is enough, but having the double reason helps. What are the two reasons? So when a person is walking and the clothes are waterlogged, even if they do happen to squeeze water out of their clothes as they're walking, number one, it's unintentional. And number two, it's not the normal manner. Normally, if you're squeezing juice or water out of something, it's with your hands, you wring it, you various things. So just regular walking is not the usual manner. So if it was only one of these factors, not the usual manner or unintentional, then we wouldn't allow people to do it. But because it's both these factors, so it takes us 2 steps off a malacha, of actually doing the real breaking of Shabbos, then the 2 steps off is enough to make it permissible. So he can walk home, even though he's waterlogged, even if water gets squeezed out, because A, it's unintentional, and B, it's not the normal manner. But when he or she take off their the clothes that were wet, also the shatkon kadesh baishu, they can't spread it out to dry out. Now, this is not only if it got wet from the rain, even if it was from perspiration. We're living in hot climates. In Arizona now, we're over 100 degrees. We get to 120 in the middle of summer. Some places also very humid. So the clothes can also be a little wet. So also the shatkon, we can't spread them out, because that looks like doing laundry. The chol shekain, how much more so? Also the shatkon neged ha'esh, we're not allowed to spread them out opposite the fire or near fire. The filo in lavish pem also la'amod neged ha'esh, and even if we're still wearing those clothes, we can't stand in front of the fire, but makim shecham harbe, in a place where it's very hot, because then we're drying out we're actively drying out the clothes, and that's part of laundry.
Rob, I have a question.
Yes.
If a person normally during the week hangs up his shirt, when he takes it off, not necessarily to dry from sweat, but just he puts it on a hanger. So is that a problem?
That probably is, that wouldn't be a problem, especially if it's in a place where he puts it all the time, particularly inside the house. And as we started to have introduction to this last time, we spoke about also a lot of raincoats aren't really water absorbent, so they're not actually waterlogged. It happens to be water on the surface. So if you put them, let's say, over the shower or something, that's also not as problematic, particularly on a hanger. So yes, so if we just hang it up like we usually do, so essentially putting it away, so to speak, then that should be okay. So we say, likewise, you can't shake it out. Again, this is a waterlogged garment. A lot of the raincoats we have today where it's just on the surface, that's not the same issue. Or beged shumakbed al mamov. Now, let's say you have a certain clothing that your particular doesn't get wet. Certain things can get ruined in the water. After you take it off, you're not even allowed to touch it. It's like muksa. Why? We're worried you're going to come to squeeze it out. So this chapter essentially is a fence around the Torah. We spoke briefly a few weeks ago about muksa as the stereotypical example of putting a fence around the Torah. So we'll just have a little repeat in case some people weren't with us that year or they don't recall. So for an example, one of the things we can't do on Shabbos is to write. We can't write letters or numbers or symbols. So when they built the Mishkan, they wrote letters on each beam. So there was 2 beams went into sockets, and that as they made the frame of the wall. And each beam had to go back in its set place. So they were all leaded, and each one had a lead on each side. So one said Aleph on the left, and it was next to the one that said Aleph on the right. And the one that had Aleph on the other side had a base on its other side, and that went next to, so they all went in order. So the writing is the issue. Now, when we say the sages is a rabbinical decree, it's actually from the time of King David and King Solomon. They instituted muktzah. So for anything that doesn't have a purpose on Shabbos, we can't touch. So an example is, we can't write, so you can't hold the pen. Now, obviously, they didn't have pens like we have today. You know, they used a quill or various things, or one made of reeds, but the same idea. And the way this protects us is, you know, if we were allowed to handle pens, so, you know, the people like playing with things in their hands while they're talking. So they'll be playing with a pen, and without thinking, they'll draw something or write something, and then, God forbid, they've the broken Shabbos. Well, if we don't even allow the person to hold the pen, then what's the worst case scenario? They forget for a minute, they pick up the pen, and then whoops, and they put it down, and they didn't actually do the malacha. They didn't do an act, which was one of the acts in the construction of the Mishkan. So they actually haven't broken Shabbos. So muktzah is a fence around the Torah. So here we have another fence around the Torah. We've said that this clothing, that if it's a type of clothing that we're worried, we're concerned, we don't normally allow it to get wet. If it does get wet, then once we've taken it off, it's also muktzah. We can't touch it in case we come to squeeze it out. So let's talk about these rabbinical decrees in general. Now, every decree is a little bit different to the other, but there's a common theme that runs through a lot of them. So for an example, when they instituted these things, they made exceptions. So for an example, an ill person. So let's give an example of that. Technically, since only Jewish people have the mitzvah to keep Shabbos, non-Jews do not have the mitzvah to keep Shabbos. As a matter of fact, they're not allowed to keep Shabbos. A side point to this, if there's someone who's converting, they're in the process of wanting to convert, and therefore they're practicing keeping the mitzvahs when they're close to finalizing the conversion. So they might start keeping Shabbos as a practice. Now, since they're still not Jews, they didn't convert yet, they're not allowed to keep Shabbos. So how do you do both? So although they practice, they have to deliberately break Shabbos once every Shabbos. They turn on the bathroom light or something, turn it off. They have to make sure to do it because they're not able to keep Shabbos yet. So technically, you could have a non-Jew do everything for you on Shabbos. Now, obviously, that becomes problematic because if we hired a non-Jew to follow us around and do everything, turn on the light, turn off the light, fix this, fix that, do something else, then we might technically be keeping Shabbos, but it loses the feel of Shabbos. The spirit of Shabbos is lost. So around the times of the Greek occupation of Israel, that was the first time that we actually lived in the same neighborhoods as non-Jews. Till then, let's say, for an example, though the Plishtim lived in Israel, but we were at war with each other. So no one invited one of the Plishtim into their house, one of the Philistines into their house, to light their fire, because you kept that person, who knows what they're going to do, God forbid. But for a large time of the Greek occupation, there was a relative peace. So at that stage, there was a decree made that we can't ask a non-Jew to do things for us on Shabbos. However, when this decree was made, certain exceptions were put in place. So one exception, for example, is someone who's not well. Now, we're not talking about danger of life. Danger of life, even a Jew can and should break Shabbos to save someone's life. But they're not well. So let's say someone is in bed with the flu, God forbid. Right, we should all be healthy. But, they're not going to die from it, but they're not very comfortable. It's quite a bad head flu, let's say, and they really need the light off or something else, hot tea. So now we can ask a non-Jew. When the sages made the decree that we can't ask a non-Jew, they put an exception in place. It doesn't apply for sick people. Another exception they put in place was for the community. So I can't ask them for me, but you can ask communal needs. Another exception for many rabbinical decrees is for a mitzvah. So if there's a mitzvah that needs to be done, sometimes the rabbinical decree doesn't apply. And that's what we're going to have in number 36. So we said we don't want to get our clothes soaking wet because we're worried about squeezing out the water. So number 36, someone was walking and they come to a stream or a canal. Now today, thank God, cities are a little better organized, and there's usually bridges over canals, footbridges and various things. But they used to have quite a few canals, and again, most of our water, the pipes are underground. The pipes used to be above ground. So you have this water canal, and you need to get to the other side. Right? And just before we continue, as we've had a few people join, just mentioned today I'm on the phone, so I can't see everyone at once. So it doesn't help if you raise your hand unless you happen to be on the first screen. So if you have any questions, just unmute yourself and ask away, and don't wait for me to call on you. Okay, so this person comes to the canal. So what does he do? If he's allowed to, he's able to jump over it. Now, obviously, it depends how wide it is, right? Some canals you can't jump over. So let's deal with the small one first. So he can, even if it's relatively wide. In other words, it's a big effort to jump over. And it's better for him to jump over it than to walk around if it's going to make the trip much longer. So what's the issue here? The issue is on Shabbos, we try not to exert ourselves for no reason. Now, some of us may live a long walk from shul, and we do the walk, but we don't do things, even if they're technically allowed, if it's going to cause extra strain. So let's say, for an example, some people train with weights, and exercise is good and healthy, but Shabbos is not the time for it because you're causing this exertion, not for the sake of Shabbos, and therefore takes away from the spirit of Shabbos. So we should save the weight training for the rest of the weekdays. So here he has whatever he does is going to be extra exertion. If he does his big running leap, that's one type of exertion. Or if he takes a detour and goes a long way around to go around this canal, this stream. So we're saying it's better to do the running leap. That might be more exertion, but it's very short term. It's just a few moments. While doing a much longer walk, each moment of that is less than doing the big running jump, but it ends up being more because it's a much longer walk. And sometimes we have this in halacha. We'll see different principles seem to clash with each other, and we have to see which one overrules. So here it's better to do the shorter, the quicker activity, even though it's more exertion than the other. Now, for Asal Avabor, he can't walk through the screen. Why? Because we don't want him to come to squeezing out the water from his clothes. So in the previous chapter, the person was walking and it started to rain. What can you do? You can't stop the rain. Here, though, a person has a choice. Do I walk through the stream or do I not walk through the stream? Now, obviously, there are times we're walking through a stream, particularly if it's flooding. It's very dangerous and it's a life-threatening situation, God forbid, and people shouldn't do that. We see every time there's floods, unfortunately, many of the fatalities, God forbid, are from people walking through and being swept away. So we're not speaking about a dangerous situation. There's some type of stream. It's not a strong current, and it's blocking the road. So we shouldn't walk through because that will inevitably lead to us squeezing the water out of our clothes. Now, we said before when we got rained on, it's not a problem. That's because we got rained on. What can you do? Now the clothes are wet. Here, though, we have a choice not to get them wet in the first place. So it's one of these protective measures, a fence around the Torah. So we're not going to be allowed to go into the water because we don't want to get ourselves wet to the point where we're going to end up squeezing the water out of our clothes. Now, vafilo b'makom achar. Now, even in another place, b'makom she'achal lahachlich lipo b'mayim, even a place where you can it's lower, there's easier crossing. Also, leilach b'Shabbos, you can't travel through on Shabbos like that. Shemishal b'godov l'day schita, because we're worried that we're going to end up being there a little bit longer. We're going to get ourselves wet, and it's going to come to this squeezing of Shabbos. Now, the next one sort of goes together. So if someone has a question, please stop and ask. Otherwise, we'll just go through the next one and we'll discuss them together. It's like two that are one long one. Okay, so far no questions, so we'll keep going. Now, when we said you can't cross...
Hang on, I just unmuted myself.
Yeah.
Sorry. If I was breaking Shabbos, like it says save a life, what degree does that is taken to? Because if you had, say, a Shabbos guest came in, trips over a step, falls over the step and breaks a leg, and is in a lot of pain, that's not threatening life. In what do you do in that situation? If it's wait until after Shabbos and then call an ambulance?
Well,
there's different degrees.
Yeah, I think every case you have to judge on its merits. I'm not trying to cop out, but it's a you can't really give a blanket rule because everyone is slightly different. Every situation is slightly different. I will say though,
Rabbi, I could give a medical opinion. I was a registered nurse for over 40 years. If there's a possibility of a broken bone, there's a possibility of a clot coming loose from the break and going to the heart or the lungs. So you can't leave a fracture until after Shabbos. If there's a possibility of a fracture, it has to be handled on Shabbos.
Yeah. So the point that I was just about to say, thank you for that. The point that I was going to say was that we'll always err on the side of caution. Meaning you don't have to be convinced there's a danger of life. There has to be a reasonable concern that there's a danger of life. So every situation is going to be different. When someone tripped on a step, it could just be a bruise. It could be very obvious there's a very serious injury, and there's everything in between. So this is what I was saying, that every case has to be looked at its merits. Now, if you have someone available that you can ask that is familiar with the halachas, so that's a bonus. If you have to make the call yourself based on the best judgment you can, then like I said, we don't want to treat Shabbos lightly, but the halacha is we err on the side of caution. So if you have a concern, and there's been times with my children, I have 11 children, Kenan. So we've had a few incidents over the years on Shabbos. Right. And there's been times that we felt we could wait till after Shabbos. There's been times that we did something with a non-Jew helping us on Shabbos. And there's been times that we have taken active steps on Shabbos. And we've sort of looked at each case, and Baruch Hashem, thank God, each one was right. It came out after the fact that we didn't do things on Shabbos needlessly, and the ones we waited were okay to wait. So thank God, we were able, because no one's a prophet, right? Even with the best, most educated evaluation, human beings can be wrong. The definition of being human is we're not perfect. Only Hashem is perfect. So thank God, so far so good, and Hashem should bless us. It should stay that way. But, I guess I'm giving a long-winded way of saying you have to make the decision yourself based on the facts on the ground. And also, it depends, an older person with a fall can sometimes be more serious. You really just have to look at every situation.
Another very difficult situation in my last shul I was at is that there was a guest out of town, a boy, like a teenager. I think he was going to yeshiva there. And he was walking down the road, and a car came down very fast and killed him. And nobody called up the parents to tell them what happened, because it meant picking up the phone or whatever. And there was when they found out, I think they were trying to sue the people. In that situation, it's extreme situation. But
yes, calling the parents, there could be another factor, being that the parents don't know what happened, they may not answer the phone. So calling them may not have helped. So probably someone had to, and I guess if they're far enough away, you can't really travel there yourself to tell them. So it's a difficult, that could be a difficult situation. I can just imagine, if my house, if the phone rang on Shabbos, we'd probably just ignore it. We wouldn't assume a serious situation like that. So calling probably didn't help. And therefore, there's probably no point to do it on Shabbos if it's not going to achieve anything.
Right.
But something has to be done. The question is, what? And that's a terrible situation. Baruch Dan Emes, blessed is the true judge. Only, that would be a really tough call. Especially if it was out of town, I presume, it's not like you could walk over to the house and inform them in person. So you might have no choice but to wait till after Shabbos. Not necessarily because you're afraid to break Shabbos, but because just logistically.
I don't know whether they were religious or not, but anyway, whether they would.
Yeah. Rabbi?
Yes.
In the case of somebody who sustains an injury, that's not life-threatening, but if you wait till after Shabbat, it's a possibility that the person will be maimed for life. That kind of injury.
Yeah. So let's go to, that's an excellent question. To answer that, let's go one step more seriously, and then we'll work ourselves back and just make it clearer to understand. So let's use an example. Let's say a diabetic that has to inject themselves on Shabbos. Right? Now, let's just say, for example, they take an insulin injection at 9 o'clock. Now, if they miss it at 9 o'clock, their life is not in danger at 9:01. However, if we keep leaving it, it's going to become a life-threatening situation. So we don't have to wait until 5 o'clock or whatever it is when the person's, having terrible problems, God forbid. Since we know that's what's going to come to, then they can have the injection or even the blood test or whatever they need to do at 9 o'clock. Now, sometimes they don't have to test their blood every single time. Every case is different, depends to the degree, in which case, if they can, they should skip it on Shabbos. But if they're people that do need to monitor it more often, or they're feeling a bit funny and therefore they need to monitor, we can say, err on the side of caution, and we're not going to wait until it becomes an emergency. Deal with it now, because we know if it's not dealt with, then God forbid it will become an emergency. So let's go back a step, where it's not going to become a life-threatening situation, but it's going to become something very serious. So again, we have to look at each case on its own merits. Now, I think most things that become permanently maimed also have the potential for life-threatening. Let's just say, for example, not so long ago, someone near where I lived lost their finger on Shabbos. Long story we don't need to go into. Now, although people can live fine without a finger, but the fact is there's an open wound there. There's, it didn't just fall off on its own. There was a trauma, and and it wasn't very clean where it happened. So you have serious concerns of infection or various things. That person would be able to deal with that on Shabbos. Now, as it's not a heart attack where every second is vital, although if they want to get their finger reconnected, time is important. So in this case, it was in a apartment complex. There were plenty of non-Jews that they would have been able to ask to actually make the call and deal with things. Happened to be they didn't. They panicked and made the call, and people made the call themselves. But and understandably so. So there are certain things that definitely need to be dealt with. And it depends on how you define maiming also. If it's going to be a scar, all right.
That's, of course, yeah.
Yeah,
that's not what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I understand, but I'm trying to just go through the full spectrum. So, and then you've got everything in between. You got everything between serious trauma and, let's say a scar. And so I think you have to look at every case on its own merits. What is the injury? Where is the injury on the body? The general health and age of the person can make a huge difference. Something that someone who's fit and healthy, you would expect to recover from without a problem. Someone who has other issues, become much more concerning. So I apologize that I'm not really giving clear answers. And that's just because every case literally will be different. And we just have to make the best call that we can at the moment. Now, often when we make this call, when we make our decision, we make it in a few seconds. It's not like we can sit down for half an hour and really think it through. Sometimes we just have to act, or at least feel we have to act. And a person shouldn't be afraid to do that. If it comes out afterwards that it wasn't as serious as it could have been, as long as you acted in good faith, then Hashem's happy with that. As we said, always err on the side of caution. It's only, we shouldn't make it treat Shabbos lightly, and of course I know that's not what you're talking about, but someone got a paper cut, let's go run to the hospital for stitches, right? So we don't want to treat Shabbos lightly, but we're told, if we have any serious concerns, it overrules Shabbos. Again, if you're in a situation where you can have a non-Jew get involved, can make it a bit easier. I have an example. There's a person comes to my shul, and their daughter had a very serious ear infection. And there was concern that the eardrum could be ruptured, God forbid. And he wanted to know, what should he do? It was Shavuos, it was Yom Tov, it was just the other day. There happened to be, in his case, they had a non-Jewish, domestic help that came and helped. And in this case, it was much better that they made the call, and we had one of those home visit doctors, and they made the call, and any questions they got asked, they asked the parents answered, and they gave the answer. So that was an easy way to do it. But, had that not been the case, they didn't have that help, and we had the serious concern in this particular case, as we did, that the eardrum could be permanently damaged, God forbid, then they could have done it themselves. So we try to minimize the breaking of Shabbos when we can. But as I said, in a time of, every case could be judged on its own merits and err on the side of caution. I just keep emphasizing that, err on the side of caution. And as long as you're acting in good faith, if you went overboard for someone else's, to try and help, save someone, fine. May our biggest, let's be honest with ourselves. None of us are perfect. We all make mistakes, and we all sometimes do the wrong thing. The worst thing we ever did in our life was that we erred too much on the side of caution, and were worried someone's life or serious health was at risk, and we act a little bit too much than we should have. Yeah. And we should really say, although that's the halakhic answer, not halakhic answer, we should say, and we should also daven to Hashem that we won't have these problems. And Hashem should bless us all, that we'll have good health, and people around us in good health. That's what we should try and daven for. Right, any questions with that before we move back on to the... Okay. So before we were talking about traveling in the water, because you want to go somewhere. Let's say I wanted to go to the other end of town. The other end of town, there's a nice park there. And, when I push my kids on the swings over there, and it'll make a nice, pleasant family Shabbos afternoon time or whatever. In other words, all right, I just want to be a guest at someone's house, whatever it happens to be. In other words, it's optional, although it is sort of for Shabbos, but it's not really a mitzvah per se. Slightly different, though, is, let's say it's an actual mitzvah. So we're going to give examples. One example, and it doesn't have to be these examples, but one example is going to be, you're going to greet your parents. We have a mitzvah of honoring our parents. So, a good friend of mine, every Friday night on the way home from shul, he goes with his kids, they stop by his parents, and they spend a few minutes there before they go home. Obviously sometimes the whole family, sometimes they have a Shabbos meal with their parents, sometimes the parents come to them, but even the week where it's not the case, so they always go for a few minutes. So that's a mitzvah. Or let's say you want to go to a shir, you're going to go study Torah, so that's a mitzvah. And there's lots of other mitzvahs, go somewhere to shake a lulav and esrog. Okay, that would be Yom Tov, not Shabbos, and the squeezing is not so much of a problem. But whatever it is, for a mitzvah. Number 37. Now, if a person's traveling for a mitzvah and he's come to this body of water and he needs to get to the other side to do this mitzvah, going, for an example, he's going to greet his father, his parents, or rabbi, or his teacher of Torah, or he's going to visit, sometimes you have, literally someone who's greater than him in wisdom, But, in other words, sometimes another shul, other end of town, has a special guest speaker. There's someone that you can learn from. Then, Yachol la'avloi b'nahar. Now he's even allowed to cross the river. He can cross the river. In other words, he can walk right through the water. Again, we're not talking about where there's a strong current and it's dangerous. But in other words, now he's allowed to get wet. However, there is a limitation to this. Vovad yaseh shinoi. He has to make a shinoi. A shinoi means you do something differently. So there will be times, and we'll have it throughout the laws of Shabbos, where something is a borderline issue, or it's not the issue itself, it's a rabbinic decree that's a fence around an issue. Then sometimes if we do things with shinoi, with a different way of doing it, that reminds us that we shouldn't step over a certain boundary, then we're allowed to do it. So this is not an example, but just to give an idea of the concept, it's like sometimes people, tie a string around their finger to remind them about something. So because we're doing it with the shinoi, we're doing it in an unusual way, then that reminds us that it's Shabbos and we won't get carried away and do things that will actually become a malacha. So how can he cross the river with a shinoi? Kigoi, for an example, he doesn't stick his hand out from under the edge of his cloak. I mean, in those days, there wore sort of long cloaks like kaftans. But in other words, he wears his clothing a bit differently. So remember, because he's constantly wearing it in an unusual way, and this reminds him that it's Shabbos and he's got these wet clothes. Then he won't come to squeeze his clothes, because if you cross the river just normally and do things in the normal fashion, then without thinking, just as you get out of the water, you might start squeezing, wringing your clothes, which you're not allowed to do. So by wearing the clothing in a slightly unusual way, this will be a reminder that you won't do that. Another provision. Now he can't wear sandals. Now the sandals of those days are probably not like the sandals of today. The sandals of those days were not as, today's ones have buckles and, they're quite well fitting. But in those days, they sort of tied with a strap. And if he wears one of those, the kivan the ena yochel lahaktoi the kashra yofa, since he can't tie them and affix them properly, chayshinon, we have another concern. Dilmanofel, maybe they'll fall off. And he'll come to carry them on Shabbos. Now, this is obviously speaking about a place where there's not an Erev. So you can't carry on Shabbos. And we're concerned that these shoes, maybe Crocs might be, or flip-flops, that's the same type of thing. If we're going to wear them, through the stream, they'll fall off. And so we'll carry them. And so therefore we can't wear those in the stream. But with regular proper shoes, it's allowed. So another example of those, of this concept, we don't really have this in Arizona, but in some places in winter, you need to wear gloves. Here in winter, it gets cold, it gets down to 60. So we don't need the gloves. But some places, you really need to wear gloves. So many people attach their gloves with a clip to their sleeve on Shabbos. Because otherwise, sometimes people just out of habit, while they're talking to someone or it gets a little bit warmer, they just take off the gloves and carry them, put them in their pocket or something, which if there's no Erev, that's a problem. So in places without an Erev, Many people attach their gloves with a little clip to the sleeves. So reminds them, again, it's this idea of reminding us that so we remember Shabbos and we don't do what we normally do out of habit. Now, when a person goes for a mitzvah, not only is he allowed to go, but kivan shehaloch l'davar mitzvah, since he went to do a mitzvah, mutar loy af lachazoi. He's even allowed to go back the way he came, even though that means crossing the water again. So not only do we relax the rabbinic prohibition for him to cross the river to do a mitzvah on Shabbos, we even let him go back. Now, this concept applies in many areas. Now, if we use the health example that we've been speaking about, it's always good to use as an example because the most extreme. If you live in a place where they have Hatzalah, the volunteer Jewish ambulance service. So unfortunately, we don't have it in Arizona, but many Jewish cities do. So if they have an ambulance or even it's not an ambulance, they take someone to the hospital on Shabbos. Not only are they allowed to do that because there's concern for the person's life, etc., but they can even come back to be back in position in the middle of the neighborhood in case, God forbid, for there was something else. The Talmud gives us other examples. If a midwife is one of the examples, so she goes to help a mother give birth. Today, more often than not, the mother goes somewhere else rather than the midwife comes to her. But nevertheless, it's a good example. So someone goes to help. Not only are they allowed to travel or do what they need to on Shabbos to help the mother, but they can even go back walking, or whatever. They can travel further than the distance you're allowed to travel to walk on Shabbos. Or people who went to, if there was an earthquake, and they went to rescue, get people out of rubble and various things. Even when it's all over, since they went there where they're allowed to walk back even further than you can on Shabbos. Various things. So often this hinges on whether you're allowed to do the first thing, or you're allowed to do the coming back. Now, let's say now we're not speaking about where a person ran to do a mitzvah. He's gone to guard his produce. Right? I know we're worried about thieves or something, and he's not going to actively break Shabbos to do anything, but he wants to be able to, in the afternoon, sit in the field and just his presence protects the area. So he can also cross the river, even though that's not, it's not like going to hear shir. It's not mitzvah the same way, but in the brackets it says the shmiris mamonoi have a gam kenkesatz mitzvah. Protecting one's possessions is a little bit of a mitzvah. However, that person who went to guard his items, he's allowed to go, he can cross the river, but he can't come back. Only for a full mitzvah can the person come back as well as go. All right, any questions on that? Now, I know it's these last two chapters, perhaps 36 and 37, as we don't usually have to walk through the river, where we live today. It's not as practical, may not have been as interesting, but the concepts apply to other areas. So no questions? If not, we'll move on. Okay, Lamed Ches, number 38. This is more a little relevant. Tet sha'al bigdoi. we get mud on our clothes, or our shoes, or various things. On Shabbos, sometimes it's been raining, it's very muddy, or even we slip. Hopefully, just to slip, not getting hurt, but we can get a little bit muddy. So what can we do because no one wants to walk around with mud on them. So imhulach, if the mud is moist, so it just happens. We can scrape it off with our nails, with a knife, or essentially anything else. In other words, we can just scrape it off as remove it. Imhu yavesh, but if we've let the mud dry, we have a problem. Also, we can't scrape it off. The gardoy to scrape it off, can't scrape it off. Why? Because then it's like grinding. When we have the dried mud, as we scrape it off, it's going to crumble into tiny little bits, and that is the malacha of grinding. So one of the things they did in the base of Mikdash, they had the showbread, they had incense, and to make the flour of the showbread and to be able to make the incense, they had to grind these things. So that's one of the 39 activities that we use for the base of Mikdash that we can't do. So remove the mud while it's fresh. Okay. 39. Beged shacho, a black garment. So, actually, before we go to that, we'll just go back to the previous one. It's important to mention because, unfortunately, it's practical, but it's not so savory. So, I wasn't sure whether I should say it or not. But I think important to say it. Sometimes it's not mud. Sometimes we step in things left behind by a dog or another animal. The animal has gone to the bathroom. And
sweet?
No.
I
said no.
No, when I eat the sweet, I get sick.
Unfortunately, we can step in these things. We obviously don't want to trample it into our house and various things. So it's similar to the mud. Now, if it is still moist, then we can wipe it off with anything. If it's dried and it's really, the best thing is to try and bang the shoes together, and it sort of drops off, comes off. The grinding is potentially an issue if we're going to scrape off when it's all very dry. So we should try and avoid letting it get to that stage. With respect to washing our shoes. So now it depends what it's made of. We're talking about the soles. The soles is generally not a problem to wash. We can wash it off. It's not the laundry issue because it's not run under the water. It's not being absorbed into the fabric, into the material. So that's with that. And again, those with children or grandchildren know that somehow kids seem to step in these things, whether it's that or mud or something, 50 times the rate of adults. That's the joys of parenthood and grandparenthood. That's how it goes. Okay. So we'll squeeze in one more, unless we have questions. No, everyone's very quiet today. I'm getting worried.
Rob, I have a question. Just to go back to raincoats, where
Yes.
you were saying there's two different kinds of raincoats. The raincoats where everything just repels right off of it, it's like rubber, and then there's the raincoats that absorb some of the water. So which one were you saying was better than the other, or
Okay,
more
so
of a problem than the other?
that are sort of like plastic or, these nylon, these materials where the rain just sits on it. It doesn't absorb in. So those you can shake a bit more because you're not really shaking the water from the fabric. It's just coming off. And you can, hang it up in the shower or something. The ones that, let's say like a thick woolen coat that sometimes people wear more when for warmth, but a light rain, when it gets water clogged, that's when we have the squeezing issue. Because the other ones, it's not in the fabrics. You're not squeezing it out. These ones are in the fabric. So we've got to be very careful not to squeeze it out. And the other issue is also there's laundry, like doing laundry with them, because again, it's in the fabric. So the water is de facto sort of washing the fabric. So then we have a bigger problem hanging it up. So more we just need to put it down somewhere without sort of really spreading it out. You couldn't put it on a clothesline or something, but if it was over a chair, something, without spreading it out, it's not so much of a problem.
So the more it repels water, the better it is, because then it's easier to shake out?
Yes, less of a problem, much less of a problem in Shabbos. And the truth is, the ones we have with those synthetic fibers, and that it's probably a better raincoat anyway. Doesn't get waterlogged, doesn't let the water seep through.
Rabbi?
Yes.
When I was in New York, I occasionally would be caught like in a snowstorm, and I was wearing a leather coat that had a pile lining, but the leather was on the outside, and it would get, drops of water on it. It wasn't completely absorbed, but what I did, I don't know, maybe it wasn't the right thing, but I would come in, I would sort of drape it on a hot water pipe that it would drain off and sort of dry. Was this not acceptable, or was it okay?
The leather absorbs much less, so unless it's total downpour, you could probably spread it out a little bit. The hot pipe is a bit of a problem because we could also be heating up the water. It's we don't want the water, we can't evaporate water or get it hot enough that it becomes, that we don't, the prohibition of cooking on Shabbos for water is not boiling. It's much less than boiling. It's just, if you would touch it and like pull your finger back. So
wasn't even that hot.
Yeah. So we'd probably want to, if we could, avoid the pipe. If the pipe isn't really that hot, then it's probably no different to any other pipe. But if it would make it warm, quite warm, then we should hang it over something else instead.
Thank you.
It's okay. All right. So that's the hour.
I have one question, Rabbi.
Please.
If I may. In the matter of shoes,
Yes.
whether we have a leather sole or a rubber sole, rubber does not absorb water, while leather does. So is there the distinction between a leather and a rubber sole relative to cleaning the sole?
Yeah, no, so we're talking about mud or stepping in something not so nice.
Right, yeah.
That's not really going to soak through. I mean, leather sole, if you really got it wet, the water would eventually come through. So those things, it's more just a matter of wiping it off. It's not a squeezing
I
issue.
got it. All right, so the sole is a thicker substance, so therefore it really doesn't penetrate.
Yeah, so the issue of squeezing the liquid out doesn't become an issue.
Okay.
We would still
thank
have the
you.
issue if it dried of grinding, but if we can get it off while it's moist, scrape it off with something or wash it off with something, that's not going to cause a problem.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Welcome.
What about when it's already dried and you're going outside and that's sort of re-wetting the shoe?
So your regular walking, don't be worried about it. And if the byproduct of that is that when you get where you're going, now it's moist again and you can clean it off, just take advantage. And hopefully it'll all come off as you're walking. Okay. Any other questions? All right. So we'll wish everyone an amazing week. And almost Shabbos. Yes.
Yes, Rabbi.
Rabbi,
Welcome. Yes.
my name is Moshe. What happened on Shabbos? Let's say, in a Beit Knesset, let's say, Sfardim, they duchen, and they come in and they have to, they have an issue taking off their shoes, in the process, before their hands are washed, before they do Netilat Yadayim. What's the halacha with regards to that? I mean, if there's water on the laces, and or if there's an issue with the Velcro or whatever the situation might be.
Yeah. So the Velcro's, you're talking about if it's waterlogged.
Yeah.
Yes. So you ended up with wet shoes. To take them off is probably easier because you can slide out relatively, a lot easier than you can put it on. You're not really applying the pressure. So take them off is not necessarily the problem. Now getting them back on, hopefully by the end of davening they've dried out a little bit. The duchen is going to be a musaf, or you're talking about, or during the weekdays, even Shabbos. So it's still there's, you've been half an hour or whatever in shul. If it's really waterlogged, I guess just be really careful. You don't have to walk. You don't have to leave with no shoes. Walking around particularly in the cities, without shoes is, can step on all kinds of things. God forbid. When I was a kid, actually growing up in Australia, there were still places where in summer people walked around with no shoes on. You go to the supermarket or something with no shoes. But today, unfortunately, there's broken glass everywhere. There's sometimes syringes, it's, just try the best you can.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
All right, so we wish everyone an amazing week and a wonderful Shabbos. And we look forward to seeing you again next week.